Hello and welcome to the Africa Fashion Futures podcast. On this research podcast series, we share insights and expertise on the fascinating world of African fashion. You'll hear from academics and industry experts and also learn about the opportunities and innovations that they see in African fashion and the work of African designers. My name is Dr. Lauren England. I'm a lecturer in creative economies at King's College London, and I will be your podcast host for this episode. I've been working with my colleagues Dr. Eka Ikpe, Director of the African Leadership Centre, and Roberta Communion, Professor of Creative Economies, researching African fashion and creative economy development in Africa since 2019. This podcast series is supported by the African Leadership Centre, the Department of Culture, Media and Creative Industries, and a Global Engagement Partnership Fund from King's College London. This episode of the Africa Fashion podcast is a conversation with Her Royal Majesty, Queen Ronke Ademiluyi-Ogunwusi, the founder and producer of Africa Fashion Week London and Nigeria. Africa Fashion Week London is Europe's largest fashion event promoting and nurturing African and African-inspired design talent. And today we'll be speaking about the evolution of Africa Fashion Week as an organisation and going deeper into how they and Queen Ronke herself is approaching sustainable fashion and women's empowerment and leadership. So firstly, thank you very much, Queen Ronke, for joining us today. It's great to have you with us.
Thank you for inviting me. It's a pleasure.
You started Africa Fashion Week London back in 2011, and then you've created that sister event in Nigeria in 2014, and now you're expanding to Brazil, which is really exciting as another international connection. Could you take me right back to the beginning to what inspired you to start Africa Fashion Week London in the first place?
Thank you. The inspiration came from the lack of a platform that showcased African brands back then in 2011. I don't think it was deliberate that they were omitted from the mainstream fashion industry. I think a lot of people then just did not understand, what African fashion was about. So it started then, to bridge the gap between the African designers, the African textile and garment industry, and consumers and, the Western fashion designers as well. So it started out of that moral obligation and urgent need for African designers, to strive for them to be able to become sustainable brands. Because for creativity to grow, there needs to be a platform that promotes and showcases its growth, its creativity for it to grow. Yes. So that's how it all started.
Thank you. It's a really interesting to hear, obviously, something that's grown so internationally, having that interest in providing an alternative, both an alternative platform, but also one that brings it also in then connection with the mainstream, say, fashion industry in the UK. I wonder if you could expand a bit then why it was then important to develop like a sister event in Nigeria to have that presence on the continent as well.
So after the huge success of Africa Fashion Week in London over the years, so we had it for 3 years before we started the sister event in Nigeria, was important, to enable us and reduce the cost of the showcasing logistics for African designers who wanted to partake in Africa Fashion Week London, but could not afford the logistics that came with showcasing in London. So the cost of a flight ticket, cost of putting their collection together, and the entire showcasing cost, hotel accommodation and all of that. But they were equally talented designers who needed a platform to thrive as well. Because we realized that a lot of the designers and what the challenge, a lot of the designers that they were facing then, that there wasn't a common ground, there wasn't a common entity that brought, the fashion houses or the fashion brands together, resulted to lack of visibility and lack of awareness, unlike now where you have so many Africa Fashion Weeks everywhere. In almost every city around the world, you would have an Africa Fashion Week. Unlike then, African fashion was not popular. So the designers needed a platform. And that was why we started, the sister event, Africa Fashion Week Nigeria, to reach out to designers within the African continent who couldn't afford, the logistics of traveling to the UK to showcase their designs and creative talent.
Brilliant, thank you. I wonder then, what do you think has met some sort of this quite recent real emphasis on showcasing African fashion designers and celebrating that creativity? What do you think is driving that popularity that we're seeing for the work of designers, and whether you think that there is something that African fashion can teach the world in that sense by having that new visibility?
I think it's the creativity of the new generation of African designers. So decades ago, African fashion was, it was more geared towards the traditional fashion that our grandmothers and great grandmothers and mothers used to wear. But I think the new generation, the influx of the new generation of designers they've kind of brought a modern twist, to African fashion. They've made it more wearable and, making it more accessible, that even if you're not from the African continent, even if you don't have anything to do with the African continent, and you see a design from an African designer, it might appeal to you, unlike before. So I think that has helped. Yes. So the creativity the new creativity from the new generation of African designers, I think that has really helped in making African fashion popular, because we also have we have a new generation of young Africans in the diaspora who have never been to Africa before, but are now embracing their African culture, and the best way to do it is through fashion. Africa is a continent with about 54 countries and about 3,000 tribes. And each tribe has its own unique fashion culture. So for me, I think we're just scratching the surface of African fashion. We're not even there yet. And I think that has really helped, in making African fashion more popular, as opposed to back in the days when, everyone was shying away from it. Now everyone's embracing their cultural identity, the uniqueness in the African fashion and African designs. For me, I think that is what has made it, really popular, as opposed to when I was growing up back in the 90s, where we were all shying away from African fashion.
It was particularly interesting what you said, that also the diaspora designers also sort of staking a claim very much in this space. Is there a particular creativity that comes from African designers, either on the continent or in the diaspora, who are producing for African consumers rather than producing for a global market?
Yes. So a lot of the designers who come to showcase on the runway in London or even in Nigeria actually produce to a large scale for their countries, but they just want the global awareness. They just want visibility. So when they come to showcase at Africa Fashion Week London, there's that kind of stamp of authenticity. And then when they go back home, when they go back to their various countries, it gives them more prominence. From the feedback we get, their sales goes up in their country, because London is one of the fashion capitals of the world. So for them, it's a stamp of authenticity that, we've been to Africa Fashion Week London, so this authenticates our brand. This shows that, we're now an international brand.
That's really interesting to think about how that international visibility and platform has an impact, sort of going back to more domestic markets. Is that a part of an interest for you to support that through also those other international connections, for example, through the development of the new Brazil Africa Fashion Week?
Yes. So the development of the Africa Fashion Week Brazil is also it's a collaboration with our partners in Brazil, and it's also a fusion between African fashion and Afro-Brazilian fashion. There are up to about 90 million people in Brazil who are of African ancestry. So an event like Africa Fashion Week in Brazil would bring enormous benefits to Brazil and Africa as well, in terms of, collaborations between the designers, cultural exchange as well, promoting trade and so many other things, trade opportunities, cultural exchange programs, a fusion of, both of our fashion worlds. So the fashion world in Brazil and the fashion world in Africa as well. And also using fashion as a key driver of tourism, in both continents. Because when our designers showcase on the runway, they don't just showcase fashion, they showcase their cultural identity. identity, with their fabric, their visuals they use. It's all about storytelling, or doing it through fashion.
It's really amazing to hear you kind of articulate so many of the different layers we've also been trying to explore in our research. So think about those different international connections, the spillover effects across industries, and how it's so multifaceted in terms of the market capacity, but also that really intrinsic connection with, as you said, culture and identity and heritage in ways that maybe that's particular to fashion in its capabilities of doing that. Well, I wanted to also give some space to talk about sustainable fashion as well as an element of that, because I know the 2022 Africa Fashion Week London focused on sustainability, showcasing some amazing designs from recycled materials, organic fabrics. So I wanted to ask why you think it's important for organisations like Africa Fashion Week to be focusing on sustainability.
For Africa Fashion Week, sustainability in the fashion industry is crucial to our organisation because, it allows us to make a positive impact on global environment efforts and also promote social responsibility. And at the same time, it enables us to meet the consumer demands. So sustainability to us is one of the key driving elements at Africa Fashion Week.
It's really interesting to hear you speak of the connection with education as well, because I know that's an area you've worked in. Is your education work, is that also focused on fashion, or also more widely about business and entrepreneurship?
At the moment, our education program is centered around fashion, and we have mentor in the Africa Fashion Week mentoring scheme that we do in the UK, where we work with fashion design students. We collaborated with University of Northampton, where we were able to pair them. So the fashion design students, we were able to pair them with African fashion designers who have vast experience within the fashion industry, to support them in their work. We had to get representations, that the students could align with, because they were having some challenges in terms of their fashion designs and their creativity. So we paired them with mentors. The designers that we paired them with were able to help them with a lot of the questions and a lot of things that they were seeking answers to or help with, that at that point in time the lecturers in the university had they couldn't really help them with, in terms of practicing the African fashion.
I think that's really important thing also about who is teaching on fashion design courses. I know we've got some practitioners joining our network who are actively involved in thinking about representation and then the experience of African students in these creative courses. How their designs are recognised or understood, and how their practices can be best supported. Are you interested in expanding towards working with more university partnership models, something that you're interested in developing further, thinking about those sorts of partnerships?
We're open to expansion, and we would love to work with universities across the UK who are interested in what we do, definitely.
It's great to see there also being, a pipeline or a follow-through event for these students to see themselves having that platform to showcase their work at, that is so both dedicated to African fashion, but also about providing it with an international platform, which seems really important. I know you've also founded the Adire Textile Hub, which I believe is focused on developing sustainable textiles. Is that right?
Yes, it is. It's focused on developing sustainable textiles.
Could you tell us a bit more about that hub? What's your ambitions in terms of developing sustainable, ethically sourced fabrics?
Okay, so the Adire Textile Hub is located in Ile-Ife, in the southwest of Nigeria, Osun State to be precise, as a COVID Fashion Week, set up as a COVID bounce back facility to help women and young people within the southwest of Nigeria. We had 6 acres of land gifted to us by His Imperial Majesty, the Oni of Ife, and we also had seed funding as well to start up the hub to train women and children about sustainable practices within the textile industry. Also to encourage designers, African designers. Over the years, we learned that African designers do not have the capabilities or the capacities to mass produce for their collection. And even if they would do the 1,000 runs that the international designers do, they don't have a platform to sell it. So it ends up wasting. They end up throwing most of the products away. So if they they would do 1,000 of a design, they would end up selling 100. And at the end of the day, they might have to probably throw the rest away. So the Adire Hub, is a textile hub that encourages designers not to waste fabrics. We encourage, small production runs as opposed to the mass or large production, as opposed to the large runs that the production hubs in the Far East would do. So that was one of the aims of us opening the Adire Textile Hub.
Amazing to see it both as a COVID initiative with that emphasis on providing employment and training opportunities for women and girls, which we'll come on to speak about another passion of yours, but also this idea of it providing that starting point for designers to think more sustainably and also as an innovative example of how you can promote sustainable fashion design from an organisational perspective. That's one of the things we're really interested in our research in terms of looking to examples from Africa, African designers and organisations working in the fashion space as exemplars of innovation, and particularly in the area of sustainability. In addition to your own hub, I wondered if you have any reflections on ways in which you see African designers or organisations working in fashion in Africa or with African fashion designers who you think are also innovating in relation to sustainability.
We've had a few designers on our runway, both in Nigeria and in London as well, who practice upcycling, recycling and ethical fashion as well. We have a designer who comes from West Africa, Togo every year. Her brand name is called Victoria Grace, and she does a lot of upcycling and recycling, with her collection. A lot of clothing items are dumped on the coast of Africa from the West. A lot of used clothing items are always, dumped on the shores of Africa. So what she does is she goes around, she picks up hundreds of these items that are dumped, and then she recycles them and makes them into new wearable designs, and she sells them. And we have a few of our designers who are doing that. And also we have designers who are particular about, when they come to the textile hub, they want to use organic cotton, for their collection. They want to ensure that we're using dyes, that are not harmful to the environment. They want to ensure that we're using plant-based dyes. They want to ensure that we're using vegetable-based dyes as opposed to, the chemical-based dyes. Because prior to, I would say centuries ago, African fashion, African textiles, African garments were all organic. They were all made out of organic practices. We used to use the indigo dye, which we processed naturally. In the 60s, there was the introduction of, so many dyes with different colors, but also chemical-based dyes that were really, really harmful to the environment. So we're trying to shy away from that. Some of the sustainable practices, that we teach our designers, and also that some of our designers as well, tell us that they want. We're also looking into things like using orange peels, banana peels, pineapple peels, for fabric, converting them into fabrics.
That's amazing, and to hear you sort of make that connection, also innovate using more traditional processes, kind of bringing that back into play in order to create these new textiles and then new garments by drawing inspiration from the traditional practice and more craft-based practice as well. How you mentioned that this is also a platform for training women and girls. Why is that an important feature of the hub for you?
Because as a woman myself, and especially as an African woman, women they're often put at the bottom of the ladder, when it comes to equality. So I'm really, I'm an advocate, for women empowerment. I'm an advocate for education of girls, because in some parts of Africa and also in Nigeria as well, educating girls is seen as a taboo. Girls, they're not really keen on getting an education. So for me, women and girls are, especially women, they are employees here at the hub, are 80% women. We provide platforms for women to strive. And we also, we have educational scholarship, for young girls to go to school, to stay in school as well. Like I said, women are often left at the bottom of the ladder here in Africa. I know other parts of the world, but I can only speak from an African perspective. And that's why I am keen on anything and everything, that supports and empowers the growth of women.
And is there something that you think is specific about fashion and textiles as having a capacity to support women's empowerment and leadership opportunities?
Well, I would say in Nigeria, the textile and garment industry is actually 80 or 90% women focused or women based, because it was actually seen only recently that it's been seen as a lucrative profession. It was actually something that was left to women. So the dyeing of the fabrics, the making of the garments, the traditional weaving, everything was left to women because they saw it as a profession that wasn't really, really lucrative. But all of a sudden, it's now become a very, very lucrative profession, and men are also interested in it. So I would say yes, it's something that it's driven by women, it's women focused, and it's dominated by women.
So it becomes then an industry where there is space for women to kind of stake a claim.
Oh yes, it's an industry where there is space for women to thrive. Yeah, the fashion industry. And that's why for a long time, I actually wanted to study. I studied law at West London University. But prior to that, when I was growing up, I wanted to study fashion. But I wasn't encouraged to study fashion because it wasn't seen as a profession that someone could thrive in. It was seen as the lowest of the low professions. If you wanted to study fashion back then, you would be discouraged and told that no, you had to be a doctor or you had to be a lawyer. Fashion then was seen as a profession for those who didn't have a really high IQ. So it was just, you know what, you can't go to school, go and study fashion. Or you can't go to school, go and study tailoring. Unlike now, at Africa Fashion Week, I have seen young people who have graduated in engineering and medicine and law. And after their graduation, they would come to me and want to learn about African fashion. So they have always had a passion for, the fashion industry, but they were not encouraged, to go about studying it. But now a lot of young people are now proud, they say it with pride that they're studying, fashion design courses. They're studying, design and textile. They're studying garment construction. Unlike before, where it was left to people with who they thought had a low IQ. And that was why it was geared towards women. So we were not encouraged, to go into professional courses.
It's really interesting to see that both that industry shift over time and also then the social perception shifting as well. The story of not being encouraged to pursue fashion in education is a story we've heard many times from the designers that we've interviewed. I think my favorite one was someone went to study geology or sort of civil engineering, and then has started this amazing fashion brand where you can also sometimes see the influence of their previous studies in their design.
Oh yeah, I think it's the fusion of education now behind it. So not just the traditional artisans or the traditional seamstresses, but now there's a vision of, they bring their education into it as well. So it'll be more innovative. It allows them to be more unique in their designs. It'll be more diverse as well.
And how do you see that relationship then changing between? Sometimes when we've spoken to designers, there's a big distinction made between the work of the designer and the work of the seamstress or the tailor. Is that something you've observed, or what dynamics are you observing in that relationship between the designers and those that they may be employing or outsourcing some of their fabric garment construction to?
Well, the designers need the tailors, they need the seamstresses as well, because most of the designers did not know how to construct a garment. They can design it, but so they do need the work of the tailors. So the work of the tailors, who are mostly women, their work is very, very important, because most of the tailors, in Nigeria and in Africa are women. It's a women industry. I would say about 70% women and 30% male, or it's a female-dominated industry. And that was because of the social perception around it then. But the designers do need the tailors. And that's why we're trying to encourage, more production hubs in Nigeria that could actually produce garments, but in small runs as well. because we don't have a lot of that as well. The designers will still have to outsource. I know a designer that buys fabrics from us, but she has to take the fabrics. She has to still export the fabrics to Turkey, to have the garments in Nigeria to sell.
That's so interesting, that international movement of the fabric of the garment to come back. That's something we're really interested in those international connections with the import and the export dynamics. One of the aspects we're looking at in our research is trying to understand how you can support value retention in African countries of production. So where the design is taking place on the continent, we're looking at potential for also local sourcing and local market development, rather than a reliance on an international market, on export and international trade, to think about where there is capacity for that. So I wonder, the designers you're working with, who are they targeting for their designs? Is it an international audience? Is it a domestic market, or perhaps a regional sort of West African market?
A few of the designers we're working with, especially the ones in the diaspora, their target audience will be an international market. The majority of our designers who are, who are based in Africa is more, an African market and then a market in their country. Something as well that we're looking into is also the logistics of sending these items within Africa, promoting trade relationships within Africa as well. Because sometimes while we were doing our research, we found out that sending a garment to the UK or the US or Europe from Africa is much more cost effective than sending it to another African country from Nigeria. So in terms of logistics, we're also trying to see how we can tackle that as well. Because I know we've had talks with a few logistic companies. We've also had talks with trees to see how we could make this process or this, much more easier than it is at the moment.
It's obviously a very big role for policy and governments to think about. Yeah,
I was going to say that's another one of the challenges that the designers face as well. The designers have always complained about that it's easier for them, to have trade relationships with the West as opposed to having it within the African continent.
I think also when we think about sort of sustainability, in terms of sort of the carbon footprint of transport and that sort of logistics aspect, but also potentially that they're missing out on a huge market. That's a really big focus, I think, for our research, particularly the work that Dr. Ikpe is interested in terms of supporting development in Africa by African designers and creatives and entrepreneurs, to think about how do you foster that type of domestic market and regional market growth to be able to tap into a market that may have previously been hindered by policy and trade relationships. Absolutely.
So we're open to having, students, from around the world. So we have like a 7-day residency, students from around the world come and learn about our sustainable practices, how we make our organic dyes, how we make our how we source for the dyes and make them, how we source for we use to make the dyes, how we make the designs on the fabric as well, and the visuals, the storytelling behind it, and things like that. And this is what we do at the Adire Hub with our international residency program.
I hope one day we'll be able to visit. We'll actually be in Nigeria in November, so perhaps we can try and arrange to come and see it.
Oh, fantastic. That would be amazing.
It sounds like exactly the kind of place we'd love to see and learn more about. Thank you for listening to this episode of the Africa Fashion Podcast on Africa Fashion Week London and Nigeria with Queen Ronke Ademiluyi-Ogunwusi. We've been delighted to hear about the work of Africa Fashion Week London and how it's expanded internationally. We also hope that you've enjoyed finding out about the work of the Textile Hub and Queen Ronke's work towards women's empowerment in Nigeria. You can find out more about her work and Africa Fashion Week London on their website, which is africafashionweeklondonuk.com. You can also find a link to this website in the show notes on the website. Thank you for listening, and we hope you'll join us again for another episode of the Africa Fashion Podcast.